justice. The decision not to try the three youths as adults for their crimes angered more than the Indian country. The leniency of the sentence caused an uproar in white Farmington as well. A sheriff deputy summed up public reaction best: "I don't get along and the next old boy don't go along," with a 15, 16-year-old kid who knows right from wrong and does something like this getting off with 2 years at Springer. I mean, it's just not right. I don't care whether the people they killed were white, Navajo, black, whatever. On a deal like this, a kid that age ought to be held responsible for his actions. They're big enough to unalive somebody, they're big enough to pay the penalty. Whatever else they might have felt about militant Indians marching down Main Street, few were prepared to defend the decision. Left to wonder what kind of justice had been done, many were hard-pressed to come up with a better explanation than the one advanced by the militants. White man's justice allowed horrible things done to people to go unpunished. In the days after the ruling, the public searched for someone to blame for what was being called a travesty of justice focused on the man who presided over the case, Judge Frank Zinn. His decision to the newsmen from the hearing, as it was reported in the Farmington Daily Times, had initially raised questions about the fairness of the proceedings. As a reporter asked the judge to scan a copy of the Children's Code, which had been interpreted as allowing news media at closed juvenile hearings, the judge walked quickly past the reporter into the courtroom, commenting he knew what was in the Children's Code and adding, "I decline to acknowledge its requirement in this case." This was followed by an editorial entitled "Judicial Secrecy," which criticized Judge Zinn for being insensitive to the public interest. It read in part, "While we think the judicial process should take every precaution to protect the right of a defendant, adult or juvenile, to a fair disposition of a charge or allegation, it is difficult to see how the bearing of reporters from Friday's proceedings could contribute to this protection. Rather, the judge's decision leaves too much room for doubt in the minds of many people who feel the public is entitled to know the legal determinations in a case which has attracted as much attention as the one in question." The judge's action in barring newsmen from the hearings fuels the suspicions of those who already have decided that the suspects will not receive just punishment for their crimes. The editorial in the Aztec Daily spoke more of the public response. It is safe to say that the reaction following news reports of the hearing was loosely along the line that Judge Zinn should be hung, drawn, and quartered, or inflicted with some such punishment for having been so soft on these boys. This was not the first time a decision on Judge Zinn's had drawn the ire on the community. Several years earlier, a few days before Christmas, when passing sentence on a college student who had been caught unloading 800 pounds of marijuana from a plane into a van at nearby Lake Navajo, or Navajo Lake, Zinn had given him a deferred sentence, remarking, "This is a present from Santa Claus." Townspeople were ready to string him up then too. Nor were those who pled cases before him always sure to the conventions he adhered to. Zinn was notorious for telling the public to kiss his ass by his actions. Assistant District Attorney Tom Hines would recall, "The greater the outcry and outrage from the newspaper and the public in case, the more likely he was to do the opposite of what was expected. But just because Judge Frank Zinn refused to explain or justify a controversial decision to the press or public, that didn't mean he didn't have his reason or believe that what he was doing was right in the light of the law. As he could say to me some 14 years later, in the first interview he would give on the case, he was simply following the advice given him by his father, a former state Supreme Court justice. He said never be concerned about what he called the four P's: politician, press, preachers, and pedagogues, and what they have to say to you, because they don't really care about the answers to their questions. Most of the time they've got something else in mind and are addressing their constituents, not you. So don't even bother to reply. It was a Caribbean cruise that designated Frank Zinn the judge in the case. At the time he lived in Gallup, where district court judge, he heard all of the criminal cases in McKinley County, but there weren't enough cases in that sparsely settled county to keep him occupied full time. So he spent 10 days each month in San Juan County, where he handled half the civil cases and all the disqualified with Judge James Musgrove of Farmington. Normally Musgrove would have handled this case, but he happened to be on vacation at the time. I guess I was just lucky. Zen would wryly suggest later the irony lying in the fact that of all the cases he would be involved with a jurist in a long distinguished career, this one would put more of his conscience and personal feelings at odds with the law than any other. Zen was a New Mexico native born in Tucumcari but raised in Gallup, where his father went to work in 1922 as assistant district attorney. He remembers Gallup when it was shoestring town, mile and a half long, a half-mile wide, population of 5,000, which owed its existence to the railroad. Kids had the run of the town in those days, or so it seemed to him as one of them, and the most exciting thing to do was pursue autographs from the big shots who came through town on the chief. Sometimes they wouldn't bother to leave the train, but stood on the observation deck smoking and gazing at the scenery. Sometimes they would dine at the magnificent Harvey House, and sometimes they stayed over to take an Indian detour out onto the reservation, signed 8 by 10 glossies of cowboy star Tom Mix and silent screen siren Clara Bow top Frank Zinn's collection. Watching all those interesting and important people come and go on the train, the yearning to someday be a railroad engineer would stir his imagination, but this was only once in a while, because he never ever since because he knew ever since he started thinking about such things that he was destined to become a trial lawyer just like his father. It was knowledge born in the county courtroom, where he spent much of his free time watching his father persecute cases with an elegant mix of folkness and flamboyance. The drama of a trial was as exciting to him as a movie. His father had a scarring role, and the performance kept his son spellbound. I thought it was the best show in town and never wanted to do anything else but what he was doing. On another aspect of his boyhood deserves mention, although there were only a few Navajo students in school with him, none he was close friends with because they were shy and tended to keep themselves. He grew up with a deep affection for them and for their parents, whom he'd see come in on off the reservation on their way and from town jobs. He believed the Navajo were gentle folk, and the fondness he felt toward them included a protectiveness that would remain with him as an adult. Frank was 12 when the Zinn family moved to Santa Fe in 1932, but he would return to Gallup, moving back in 1959. Both he and the town had changed a lot during those years. Social programs created during the New Deal years and after had improved the economic lot of the town as well as the tribe. You've seen the old cartoon that captions, "There's money in poverty." Well, you be there is Yeah, well, you bet there is. You put money in the hands of poor people, they spend it. You put money in the hands of rich people, they invest it. There's a big difference. You figure the Navajo people or people living on the reservation, they live free. Pay no rent, no real estate or sales tax, seldom buy insurance, so everything goes in their bellies or on their backs. And where do they take their money to get what goes in their bellies or on their backs? To civilization. And that doesn't mean the nearest trading post where they be extended a credit line that would gouge the hell out of them. They come to our town, and when they return, their pickups are loaded. As well, drinking had emerged as a major social problem for the Navajo. Now that it was legal for them to buy liquor, he recognized there were precarities to Indian alcoholism, the most significant being that they drank what they bought before they went home for fear of being arrested for possession by the Navajo tribal police. But he also believed the idea of people drinking to excess isn't any different among Indian people. As far as I can see, than it is among any other people depressed and living in poverty. Go to any big city and you can find all the drunks you want. Gallup was no different. In the meantime, Frank Zinn was graduated from the New Mexico Military Institute with a commission as a second lieutenant in cavalry, enrolled in law school at American University in Washington, D.C., and no sooner completed his third semester when he was called to do his part in fighting World War II. He served as a platoon leader in the tank unit in France, and when the war was won, he finished law school, returning to Santa Fe in criminal defense work in the practice already established his father and older brother. Several years later, following in the footsteps of his father, who had been active in state politics, he was appointed to the post of Assistant Attorney General. As prestigious as it sounded, he found himself doing most of the work for the Attorney General, which prompted his decision to run for the office himself in the next election. He lost, but ran again to get the bitter taste of def- defeat out of his system and won that time around. 6 months later, he would resign. His public reasons were given in the form of sardic wipes. The joy was in winning. The joy was in winning an attorney general. Hold on. Let Sammy in, you guys. He's not gonna stop. Oh yeah, the la. Come on. OMG. I don't know where he went, but I'm gonna have to ignore him. Sorry about that. That guy. He's so demanding. Okay. Um 6 months later, he would resign. His public reasons were given in the form of sardic wipes. The joy was in winning an attorney general was basically a ceremonial position. He didn't want to have to run for re-election every 2 years. The truth behind his decision was the governor of New Mexico at the time, John Burroughs, had come to him with a problem. A new judicial district was being formed which took in McKinley County. The people in Gallup area would resent an outsider being focused on them, and since Zen grew up in Gallup, he he accept the post as judge? He would. He did. He was 38 at the time and had some difficulty making the transition from a practicing attorney who had defended a lot of rotten guys, some who were acquitted, some who went to the pen, but my batting average was enough to keep me in business. And a judge who must divorce himself from advocacy? Put your problems, feelings on the shelf, keep both checks on the bench, and deal with issues as objectively as possible. But he liked trials, enjoyed the theatrical, theatrical aspects of criminal cases, believed that adversarial tension was a requirement of the judicial process, much in the way aesthetic tension was of value in art and literature. Only when both sides were represented with vigor and intelligence would justice be served. It was it just wouldn't do to have a district attorney blazing away while a defense attorney shuffled papers and sharpened pencils. On occasion Zen would sustain an objection no one had made when he thought an attorney was paying proper attention. While he could earn high marks as a nonsense dis, decisive decisive judge, someone's got to call balls and strikes, would become his motto. Whose sentencing was often conventional, he would put some people on probation who everyone thought deserved stricter treatment, and send others to the penitentiary people thought ought to have been set free. His popularity in Gallup was such that he could have oppositions during the first primary election, but after that nobody bothered to run against him. His reputation as fair and intelligent judge, also one step ahead of the lawyers trying a case before him, was augmented by his progressive attitude towards crime and punishment, particularly as applied to Indian people. According to Zen, the determination of what to do after a person is found guilty should concern itself with things like what's best to prevent this person from being a danger to society in the future and what might change his ways. Sometimes you just look back for 20 years. That'll change his ways sure enough, but when trying to figure what's best for society, to me that means what will it cost the least in terms for future crime or in caring for those people. Just because the law attaches a penalty to the crime, to me, that doesn't mean it should be applied to everybody regardless of his circumstances. The idea of making the penalty fit the crime is madness. I think the penalty should fit the person. From the standpoint of the criminal prosecution of Indian people, given what he knew of the Navajo Nation and their ways, he believed the law ought to accord them special considerations. Their culture and upbringing prepared them for a whole different world, and so, when their behavior came into conflict with the rules of white society, he treated them accordingly. Whites don't have a corner on crime or criminally. If an Indian did something ugly, I didn't have any compunctions about sending them away. But I have to admit, if the crime was not violent, it dealt with them like children. I dealt with them like children. I do things like put them on an honor system. Drink some water. As example would be, an Indian steals a car to get transportation home, not to claim it as his, not thinking he's getting away with something, just uses it for a ride home. So he gets in someone's car, takes it out onto the reservation, parks where the road ends, and walks the rest of the way. What do you do? It's a crime and it's a problem and it needs to be dealt with. But in those days, you could get 5 years in a penitentiary for doing that. And to take some of these guys who are half crooked when they borrow a car to get home and give them 5 years, that just doesn't make sense, particularly if the car wasn't damaged or if it was the insurance took care of it or the owners weren't adamant about prosecution. So what I would sometimes do in conjunction with the sheriff, who also recognized the special needs of young Navajo men, was let him set up his own system of parole and probation. Though it would have been considered highly proper and a risk by many, I would release the prisoners to his custody, and he would tell them their lives were in pawn to him. They had to report to the sheriff's office periodically, just like going by the trader with whom they had pawned something, to pay the interest to avoid a forfeiture or and to extend the redemption period. And if they didn't report it, if they committed some other offense, then they forfeited their freedom. In part, it was his compassion for an understanding of the Navajo that created such strong personal feelings about the case against Crawford, Burke, and Thacker. In a twist on the incipient legal question on whether the offenders should be treated as juveniles or adults, he saw the victims drunk, defenseless Navajos and children. And in previous cases where people have offended against children, who usually gave them the top of the penalty section, the maximum sentence allowable. The more he learned about what had happened in Chokecherry Canyon, the more intense his feelings became, until by the time the transfer hearing was held, he had come to the conclusion, I'd handle a good many homicides, but never one as abjectly evil as this case. The fact that this was a case that had generated a lot of community heat and from the standpoint of publicity was in danger of becoming a media circus didn't complicate things personally for Judge Zinn. Nor did it impact the way he conducted the proceedings. By this time in his career, he was adept at handling the press, to a large extent because he had a realistic understanding of their imperatives. He knew they were always in a hurry to make the day's deadline. He believed that most reporters did try to respect the bounds of objectivity and truth, but that entertainment value had softened hard news standards, putting a premium on the most sensational aspects of a story, which was understandable. He wouldn't presume to tell them how they should do their job, just as he didn't expect them to try and tell him how he should do this business of a reporter waving the children's code statutes in his face, claiming press entitlement to attend the hearing had been staged to create news itself, he suspected, which was why he had brusquely dismissed the request. It was true that statutes did permit accredited representations of the news media to be present at closed hearings, but it was a discretionary period, and in his mind and his court, the right to confidentiality in a juvenile hearing took precedence over any kind of public interest that might have been served by allowing the press to sit in. It was a summary ruling on his part that would result in indignation, suspicion, and editorial complaints, but he didn't get it a second thought. In the state of New Mexico, a bind-over procedure had to prove that the offense was serious enough, that the child was not legally insane, and that he was not amenable to treatment within the existing facilities of the juvenile justice system. Based on his previous experience with the assistant district attorney, Tom Hines, and Byron Canton, Zen felt they probably had a strong case going for them. They were not the type to charge what they didn't feel they could prove. And as a general rule, Nobody pushed for juvenile transfer to adult court unless he had a hot case from both the public standpoint and well as the evidential. The right order of business in a transfer hearing involved testimony on the crime itself, evidence that substantiated a crime had been committed which could take the form of statements or confessions, and in this case the form of Peter Burke relating his account of the whole pitiful tale as if he was describing going to a football game on a Saturday afternoon. He laid it out in monotone. He stuck a firecracker up his nose and kind of batted at it, and we laughed about it. As he listened to Peter Burke's cold-hearted chronicle of torture, Judge Zen found himself struggling to control his own emotions. He might have been able to understand if these kids had taken one Indian out into the hills and while knocking him around get carried away, or doing something the other saying, "Gee, this is fun, let's do this." Or maybe daring the other, "Come on, you afraid?" and both of them getting carried away. But after doing one, they had a week to think about it, to reflect on their actions, to wonder how it could have happened, to regret it, and that was not what had happened. The very next weekend, Burke and Crawford had gone back out for seconds and thirds, talking to this time and doing them in the same night. He had no doubt that if they could not been count he had no doubt that if they had not been caught, they would still be doing it, the numbers mounting as long as they got away with their crimes. Zen felt that such total and casual disregard of human beings' right to life left little hope for redemption, particularly when not one idea of remorse seemed to be present. He said it many times, even though he knew it was improper sentiment for a judge to admit it, that there were people in this world who deserved killing, and often the defendant in a murder trial should be given a medal for what the law wouldn't permit or civilization condone. But in this instant, as he listened to Burke testify to how he and Vernon Crawford burned and battered their victims, he found himself down, feeling that Crawford was the one who would be done away with. These were interior musings, of course, get never given voice, not allowed to influence any of his rulings, and non-technically relevant to the question confronting the court. The guilt of those individuals was not being consented, nor was the nature of their crime at issue. The matter to be resolved was how they should be treated as juveniles or adults, which was wholly dependent on the testimony of the psychiatrist. As the prosecution qualified the men who had evaluated the youth, establishing their right to express their opinions as experts, Zen's thoughts drifted ahead. In his mind, he ran through the scenario of what would happen if he did bind the 16-year-olds for trial as adults. Recent Supreme Court rulings had put the New Mexico death penalty law in limbo, so the worst the two kids could get if they were convicted of murder was a life sentence in the penitentiary. A judge who presided at the transfer hearing was automatically disqualified from the trial in criminal court, so he wouldn't be doing the same sentencing. But based on his experience, he guessed Thacker would probably be put on probation and Crawford sent to the pen. For how long, he wasn't sure. More than likely, the kid's attorney would plead, make a deal for manslaughter, and get him out in 7 or 8 years. if he lived through it, and there were no guarantees a 16-year-old in this den of snakes would make it out alive. But all these thoughts were a form of mental chess that was checkmated when the psychiatrist testified that neither of the kids met the legal criteria for insanity or incompetence, and nothing in their examinations on the records indicated that were incapable of rehabilitation. On a yellow pad, Judge Zinn kept a checklist on which he tallied the basic elements that needed to be established for a bind-over. If any questions were unasked, he would speak up. His obliviation as trial judge was to amass all the information available and develop a full record. It was at this point in the hearing that he knew the outcome. A trial judge always knows the elements you have to have in case for transfer. There are just certain things that have to be there, and you wait and listen. And if the evidence doesn't come through, bingo, she's a goner. You haven't got a case. That's what happened here. It was the burden of state to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that those were the real guys with propensities to commit crimes who would be criminals forever. There's no use wasting time to trying to salvage them as human beings. But the only time witness testified both were amenable to treatment. They were the experts, that was their opinion. They left me to no choice. I couldn't willfully go contrary to the expert testimony. They left the courtroom with no hinge, no fulcrum, no nothing. You've got to have somebody saying that at least one of these kids is a hardcore sociopath before you can bind him over. If I'd have gone against them because I felt differently, it would have been an appealable ruling and would have been overturned. Although that was little need for deliberation on his part, Zinn called a recess anyway, during which, on a visit to the men's room, he speculated on what had happened. It appeared to him that the prosecutors were let down by the medical testimony, that the diagnosis was not what they had anticipated, and he felt much of the same disappointment he imagined they did, because he would have liked to have bound these kids over, and particularly he had a strong reaction to Vernon Crawford, whom he understood to be the ringleader. He felt no sympathy for that one. Maybe the kid had problems, but he knew what he was doing and just didn't care. Some people were just no damn good, the judge thought, had no feelings for anybody, other human beings or themselves. They were the kind of people you wouldn't mind unaliving yourself. Because he would have liked to have sentenced the kid as secretly as the law allowed, and at the same time knew that those ignorant of the process would probably interpret his judgment as an act of favoritism, confirming judicial discrimination against Indian people. He felt doubly bad. For almost 20 years, ever since he donned his robes, he had particularly worked in reverse discriminatory process in law enforcement that were rampant in the border towns. Indians got in both coming and going. Crimes against whites were prosecuted vigorously, while there was a laxity and failure to prosecute crimes committed by Anglos against Indians, as well as by Indians against Indians. It was unavoidable shame that this case, which was probably the worst, could imagine, would be interpreted as fresh proof that justice depended on the victim's race. When court was resumed, he announced his decision denying the motion for transfer. He took their son he he took note of the audible relief expressed to the Crawford family as their son had been acquitted, and moved swiftly through the list of screenshots statements required for the record. Because both the defense and prosecuting attorneys were entitled at this stage to disqualify him from sitting on the juvenile case, he asked them if they had their preference. They stipulated and agreed it was all right for him to proceed, and the youth went then arranged all over again. The rest of the day was spent attending to formalities. He heard from the director of the boys' school at Springer about the capacity for existing facilities to treat kids with disposition and what kind of programs were offered. He'd heard it many times before and knew that Springer did not truly offer a real therapeutic option, just a structured environment. That was all they had for years, but the reality of the situation, the fact that there was no correctional institution in the state that really equipped to rehabilitate anybody, was not supposed to matter. What did matter by the law was that the youth were deemed amenable to any kind of treatment anywhere in the world, period, because the true purpose behind the statute, which indeed was the philosophy behind the whole juvenile justice system, was simply to give kids a second chance. When it was all over, the judgment rendered, and all three youth sentenced to the New Mexico boys' school at Springer until they were 18, after which they could be detained on a year-to-year basis until they were 21. At the discretion of Springer authorities, there were public fallout to deal with. Even though he felt personally frustrated and divided in heart and soul, Judge Zinn never let on to the press or public the nature of his own emotions. He read the editorials criticizing the way he handled the case, and he was aware that the public opinion felt his judgment sent the wrong signal, suggesting that law only winked at crimes against Indians. Even encouraging the continuing robbing and rolling of Indians is the worst part. He could you could get for killing them was Springer, and he disagreed totally. If he had been inclined to speak out, he would have argued. You don't make examples out of people in the case of public reasons. You can't do that. I can't do that. It's not right. A case has no life within its own context, and the identity and circumstances of the victims are not part of the reality. Furthermore, people who behave this way are not conscious of the punishment. They don't weigh their acts and say, let's see if I can unalive a cop. I'll go to the gas chamber. Most criminals don't care about the constituents are and don't consider them that personally true of violent criminals. A case like this is a one-shot deal. It lasts for 2 days and it's over forgotten. How long does the tone of the bell keep ringing until somebody's watching whacking the clapper? It just doesn't happen. Oh, the media people and school trackers people at that level, they'll talk about how dispositions encourage crime. They say this is a bad example for youth and so on. But the people drawn to but the people down in the sewer don't pay any attention. I don't feel this case made one nickel's worth or difference to those who roll Indians. The travesty to his way of thinking would have been if he had allowed people fervor to get ahead of justice, and it had, in his opinion, in the 1920s, in the Sacco Vanzetti case, Judge Zinn did not take unalivings lightly. This was a man who, while fighting the Germans in Europe, once put a pew-pew to the head of a man under the command who was about to execute two captured German soldiers. The same man who had saved his life in Action days before because he made a distinction between unaliving in wartime. If he could have, he would have dealt as severely with Vernon Crawford as the law allowed, but he believed the decision he'd made was right on the light of the law. As bad as he felt, there was another way of thinking about it. He wasn't so sure the best place for kids like this wasn't back on the street. Few of these kind of people lived out normal lives. Bad things had a way of happening to bad people. Somebody or someone got them for you. Within an hour after Judge Zinn announced his decision in closed court, the proper papers were signed and the three youths were hustled through the chambers to a county car parked behind the courthouse. Deputy Bruce Brimhall drove, and Deputy Chuck McGee rode shotgun. This was not their first trip to the New Mexico Boys' School in Springer to deliver juveniles, but never before they had been concerned about an ambush by lynch mob bent on stringing up their prisoners. They remained tense until they had mentored past the uniformed officers, positioned like sentries at the end of the alley, driven down the shady back streets of Aztec, and turned finally into Bloomfield Highway. Only then were they confident the ruse had worked. The boys had been successfully spirited out of town before the Indians were aware of the decision and did something drastic like surround the courtroom. Handcuffed and squeezed together in the back seat, Crawford, Burke, and Thacker seemed oblivious to the threat. To the amazement of the deputies, Crawford and Thacker even managed to find their predicament amusing, talking and snickering like it was all a big joke. Brimhall, who had been the first officer to arrive on the scene when the first body had been found, and McGee, who had responded to the call on the third body, exchanged varied glances. Neither man was happy. Let's see how many more. Oh my goodness. This one's kind of a long chapter. Was happy at the court decision. Maybe the law had been completed, but considering the brutality of the crimes and the sadistic manner in which these three had gone about them, they did not think Springer was enough of a sentence. At one point during the drive, when he heard the conversation in back turn particularly nasty, I heard one of them say, "Them squaws were more fun 'cause they fought harder, and we could screw 'em in between." Brimhall found himself so disgusted he had to suppress the urge of detour up a remote dirt road, take them out one by one, and deal each a hard hand of personal justice. Around Santa Fe, however, the laps in the back seat banner lengthened. As they passed the Las Vegas, the boys grew even more subdued. It was almost midnight when they exited the interstate at Springer, a depressed little farm town pocketed in the rolling shortgrass plains of northeast New Mexico. And 4 miles not a word had been spoken, wondering if his passengers were so cold-bloodedly blazed they had fallen asleep. Deputy Brumhall searched the rearview mirror. 3 sets of eyes blinked back at him like barn owls. The deputy smirked in satisfaction. Reality was sinking in. No more fun and games. Once the paperwork was completed and the responsibility for the rights of the three kids were officially turned over to the boys' school officials, the deputies left without a parting word. or an ounce of sympathy. They were waking up the manager of the Oasis Motel in downtown Springer as just about the same time Crawford, Burke, and Thacker were being shown their accommodation cinder block cells higher than they were wide, furnished with a thin mattress, a searless porcelain toilet, and a stainless steel sink. Lockup. The maximum security wing at Springer was designed to humble the tough guys and troublemakers and let the newcomers know that this was no boys' camp, it was a juvenile prison. At 6:15 the next morning, someone banged on the doors and ordered them up and moving. They were told not to lie down again until lights out at 8:30 that evening. If they were tired of standing or pacing and wanted to sit on their beds, that was okay, but their feet had to be firmly placed on the floor at all times. They were also told not to look out of the sliver of window in the steel door, or to try and signal the other boys in the next room, or across the hallway, or to talk even to themselves, sing, hum, or whistle. If they wanted anything, they were instructed to place a sheet of paper underneath the door with the written request and wait for the staff to answer. Their doors were open 4 times a day, once on each mealtime, when a guard did a tray of food across the concrete floor, like chow in a kennel, and again they were led to the shower area, washed and bugs off, a surly correction officer barked. Then it was back to their cells, more time to rethink about the past they had that led them there and the future that was going to be the same for an indefinite number of days, and to ponder the meaning of cryptic and haunting bloodstains that painted the walls of the cells like cave art. For the remainder of the day following the tumultuous tear gas throwing melee on Main Street, Farmington braced for an aftershock aided by a contingent of specially trained members of the state police tactical force. Farmington police, many garbed in combat suits and helmets and carrying rifles, patrol city streets. It was reported not it was reported that riot control teams were being rushed in from Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Espanola, and Gallup. As if that were not firepower enough to restore calm in the city, Mayor Marlo Webb announced that after conferring with Governor Bruce King and advising him of the situation, the National Guard had been placed on alert and would be called up if further assistance was needed. Although the outbreak of violence had been a grim enactment of scene, local police officers had anticipated for 5 previous Saturdays, all things considered, and disturbance had been quelled and order restored with remarkably efficiency. The only inquiry requiring hospitalizations was a brain concussion suffered by Farmington police officer struck by a car driven by Wilbert Sosey's sister. The major damage to downtown was smashed plate glass window at the Indian Room, a Navajo arts and crafts business. Appearing at police headquarters shortly after the downtown area had been cleared and secured, city officials, wearing attire more appropriate to the golf course and backyard gardening chores, were briefed by the authorities. After a tour of the downtown streets and police cruiser, the mayor showed up and promptly issued a statement praising the conduct of the law enforcement personnel for their professionalism and restraint. Calling the violence regrettable, he said the confrontation proved once and for all the Coalition for Navajo Liberation has been more interested in creating issues than in working problems. In spite of the efforts of the mayor to give the impression that everything was under control, the racial climate remained dangerously volatile. Anglos were irate because Navajos who had been allowed to march peacefully had not been had not accorded the same right to the sheriff's posse. There was talk that the white vigilantes organizing out of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall were preparing to launch an offensive, and it was taken seriously enough that the special undercover intelligence unit of the state police was immediately dispatched to investigate. Meanwhile, on the reservation side of San Juan River, Indians from all over the area were amassing in a show of support for the coalition. Angry speech makers attacked the justice systems in Farmington, claiming events had proved that the coalition had been right all along. Some CNL hotheads even advocated taking up arms and storming the city jail to free their leaders. The storm did have an eye, however, which began to take shape the morning after. Then several hundred concerned Indians assembled at the San Juan Apostle Mission to decide what action should be taken. Opinion was divided almost evenly between those who wanted to continue the path of confrontation with city officials and those who did not believe the demonstration and marches had achieved any progress and felt the time had come to court com- compromises. Spearheading the latter group were three prominent Navajo figures, including former state representative and a tribal councilman. Predictably, in the heat of aftermath, their moderate proposals were defeated by a voice vote of boos. But when they left the meeting in a disgust as they were climbing into their pickups, they found themselves thronged by people who agreed with them. Encouraged, they decided to move swiftly to solidify the consensus and drove to the closest paid telephone, where they called Mayor Webb and asked if they could meet with him. Dismayed but not surprised by the parade incident, the mayor sensed in the conversation of an opportunity for breakthrough in relations with responsible representatives of the Navajo people, and he went them one better. Navajo people, and he went them one better. He told them he would arrange for a meeting to be attended by other city officials and law enforcement representatives that very evening at Farmington City Hall. The news media naturally were tipped in the meeting, and the Daily Times front page coverage struck a celebratory tone. Coalition Splinter Group calls for end to marches ran the headline, followed by a two-column story whose tone was set by a lead. The first step toward healing the break in Farmington's Anglo-Indian relations was taken Sunday night in a consultory meeting between city officials and Indian representatives that was maintained through the last sentence. The meeting ended on a note of goodwill as both city officials and the Indians clasped hands and smiled, all promising to meet again. But there would be no dancing in the streets yet. In fact, once the coalition leaders were released from jail, they would immediately begin beating their war drums and denouncing the defectors of Benedict Arnold's. While charges had not been stacked against the 34 Indians arrested in the fracas, enabling most to post bond the next day on misdemeanor charges of disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace, Wilbert Sosey remained behind bars. Grabbed from behind, a picture of the Farmington policeman bear hugging him will fill a half page in the next issue of Time magazine. Sosie had broken free and was running down the sidewalk when he was tackled by two white youths, who held him down until officers caught up. After he was handcuffed, he'd been jerked to his feet and brought face to face with a classic moment in the lives of civil rights activists. The terms of the struggle had changed. A line has been stepped over, it's open combat now, and suddenly you find yourself looking into the ferocious eyes of a skull basher. Raising his nightstick, a Farmington policeman sneered, "You've been asking for this." It wasn't Wilbert's weak, bleat police brutality that halted the blow. It was a second officer with a cooler head who stepped between them, whispering to his partner, "Not now, not here." With the nightstick jammed against his throat, as if he had already tried to break away and had been restrained, he was marched to an idling police car and shoved headfirst into the back seat. Casey, his nemesis, joined him. The second cop jumped in the front seat, and the third put the car in gear. "Make a move, come on, give me an excuse," the one beside him taunted. "Press against the door." Wilbert held himself rigid. "What did you say?" The cooler head was addressing the driver. "Shall we take him for a ride?" For a single terrified moment all Wilbert Sosey's self-assurance vanished. He knew very well what could happen, and he was powerless to change anything. They could say he tried to escape, and to the process of subduing him on accident took place. They could say he pulled a fish, a NIFE, and their reaction was in self-defense, and it would be his word against three of theirs. If he was around to plead this case, that is, his eyes danced desperately, but he did not change his position. To this tremendous relief, the driver would have none of it. Next even to talk. "Cut that crap out," he snapped, "and don't mention it again." When they arrived at police headquarters, he was lifted out of by his hair and given the bum's rush inside. The next time he would see daylight would be Monday morning, when he had let out of the front door like a risk flight convict, with cuffs on his hands and hobbles on his feet that forced him to take short shuffling steps. Heavily armed guards delivered him to the arraignment at municipal court, where he was charged with battery on a police officer and unlawfully disturbing a lawful assembly. Both second-class felonies. Bail was set at $30,000. It was posted by his father. By late Monday, the leader of the coalition was back on their streets. In the days that followed, while other coalition members palavered about this tragedy should be used to take advantage of the Bursic overreaction by Farmington Nazis, as they were characterizing the parade disturbance, Wilbert Sosey was distracted by his legal dilemma. Not that there was an overlap. In fact, an intriguing offer had come his way that were very connected to the two interests, but in a way that presented complications for him. At the arraignment, he had been represented by an attorney who worked with him back in EEOC, but afterward he had been informed that the friend's position did not permit him to represent Wilbert in a criminal proceeding. He recommended another attorney, whom Wilbert called for an appointment. After listening to Wilbert's version of the events, this man stroked his chin and said he would take the case, but with all publicity it was going to be a difficult case, time-consuming, costly, and he would need $1,000 up front. Wilbert blinked. "Huh? I don't have that kind of money." The lawyer shrugged, leaving the impression he wasn't sorry about that. Back at his office, Wilbert was sitting at his desk staring into the middle distance, where the seriousness of the situation was dawning when the phone rang. The good news was it was a lawyer calling to donate his services. The bad news was that he expected in return announced to a devil's pack. The guy was calling from South Dakota where he listened among and many clients the American Indian movement. And at first he said all the right things. He made Wilbert feel like an honorable warrior returned from battle. He said he had been involved in cases like this before and no sweat when he was through. Wilbert would be a national hero. There was only one thing he said Wilbert would have to be willing to do. What's that? Go to jail. It was not even a consideration. No, Wilbert said. I just got out of jail and I don't like that place. Don't worry, I'll coach you. He heard the voice of the other end of the line saying, as if he hadn't heard, think of it as a performance. Act outrageous. Make them gag you. Make them drag you kicking out of the courtroom. The cameras will record every minute of it, and I guarantee the national spotlight will shine on you and your cause. But do you guarantee I beat these charges? Wilbur asked. The man sighed. That's not the name of the game. Well, I have got some felony counts against me, Wilbur reminded him. That could mean some state penitentiary. State penitentiary. Wait, hold on. Sorry, that was a puzzle. Uh, A small price to pay for the cause of racial justice, that man replied. Wilbert shook his head as if the man were sitting across from him. Not in an office somewhere in the Midwest. No, I ain't going to no penitentiary. Again, the man on the other end seemed to not be listening. Just give me the word, brother. My plane is waiting. I'll fly out today if you give me the word. No, no thanks, Wilbert said, and hung up, feeling the adrenaline rush that follows a close call. The next conversation with an attorney was more to his liking. Once again, a liberal attorney was volunteering his service, but unlike the one from South Dakota, James Tullis of Albuquerque did not talk like he might sell tickets to the trial. The two lawyers shared a reputation as men with radical sympathies for minority causes who entered courtroom armed with First Amendment defenses. But Tullis had a more long-term view than his ideological comrade, and less faith in the power of publicity. Realizing that most of his clients in the cases were young and idealistic, and that when they matured, they were very well could develop into fine leaders, he did not want to see career potential ruined by criminal record, and leadership, not martyrs, was what he felt the Navajo people needed. If there were some who thought and hoped that one the sting of tear gas was washed from eyes of the coalition, and after the city had been itself characterized on national network television as a synonym for cities across the Deep South where major civil rights battles had been fought, a report on the riot was beamed across America on the evening news. Each side would take a step back, realize how close they were to igniting a racial war, and discover the means to neighborly reconciliation of the differences. It was a short-lived dream. If anything, the situation deteriorated. First, the city and the coalition got into a rock-throwing contest over the presence of the horsemen in Old West cavalry uniforms. Sosi called it evidence. The city was willing to promote racial scorn. He said that by blocking their path, the Coalition for Navajo Liberation was successfully shown we are not to be mocked by a public display of our oppressors. The charge that the city was deliberately been baiting that Coalition was denied, of course, and Mrs. Schofield, co-chairman of the parade committee, incensed by the suggestion that the selection of parade participants had been politicized, proven to be a feisty point person in the ensuing debate. The cavalry unit had been planned as a special attraction before the coalition was even in existence, she stated, and it had been arranged through the local army recruiter as a way of promoting his recruitment program. Nobody travels 1,000 miles to get into the kind of trouble that happened Saturday. The lady pointed out, as for regrets about insensitivity, she said that instead of 6 men contingent they had this year, it had hoped that we can have the entire 25-member drill team for next year's parade. On a moved and informed level, a number of people chuckled over the fact that the cavalry soldier had been holding the American flag, and who had jousted with one of the militant Indians was a black man. Pitting one minority member against another, there's no big deal, John Redhouse would say, with the joke making the rounds reached him. Buffalo soldiers killed a lot of people, too, under that flag, and they were Indian scouts. Then the Special Navajo Relations Committee, which had been appointed by the mayor with great fanfare, collapsed on the night of its very first meeting when an Anglo committee member objected to the use of profanity by a member of the coalition, sparking a verbal confrontation on the spot, resignations, and eventual dissolution of the group. This was followed by a series of legal maneuverings by both the city and the coalition. Attorneys for the city of Farmington were first filing motions to deny the granting of additional parade permits to the coalition, as explained by Mayor Webb. There has been 5 marches in Farmington since the first weekend in May. Each one has forced us to draw law enforcement personnel from other areas where they are needed, and by blocking traffic, the marches hinder the business of city merchants. Those factors, together with persistent threat of the eruption of violence during a march, make further marches a clear present danger in the welfare of the community. The city succeeded in obtaining a state court injunction against the parades, but when Toulouse, on behalf of the coalition, took the issue before a federal district judge, the constitutional right of Navajo Indians to come to Farmington and air their grievances in a peaceful manner was upheld. The city again sought to enjoin further Indian demonstrations in the state court, and the outcome of an agreement between coalition and city attorneys which permitted continued parades as long as the coalition abided by stipulated guidelines on resultant procedures. Retaining the right to march was only the first of a series of moves taken by the coalition to strengthen its position in the aftermath of the Main Street riot, in an effort to keep unity in the ranks in support of conservative Navajo. Sosi and Redhouse decided it would be smart to diversify their activities, to rely less on demonstrations as a media method for addressing issues and more on the courts. Drawing on his legal background, Fred Johnson took the lead, basing legal action on public nuisance statutes. He filed a petition in district court to close 6 Indian bars, alleging that they were cause of daily violations of public, municipal, county, and state laws as a drinking in public, littering, reckless driving, and disorderly conduct. And then finally, the U.S. government entered the picture in a letter dated June 10, 2 days after the parade disturbance. Richard Avia, Regional Director of United States Commission on Civil Rights, filed a report to the commissioners in in Washington, in which he stated the racial tension in Farmington was intensified drastically in the past few weeks. In addition to the confrontation on Main Street, he cried continued instances of harassment. A Navajo man walking alongside the road was attacked by a group of knife-wielding youths and unaliving on Sunday, June 9th. The bodies of three more Indians were discovered in the Gallup area, stabbed repeatedly. His report was so alarming that it prompted John A. Buggs, Attorney General in the United States. The situation in Farmington has moved significantly beyond the specific incidents killing of three Native Americans. The Commission is aware of its series of investigations and public hearings on and near the Navajo Reservation that incidents frequently occurred in border towns that violate fundamental constitutional rights of Native Americans. The history of border town areas is replete with issues ranging from economic oppression to the effects of the brutal psychology that apparently is operative in the community, that Indian life is somehow less valuable than that of other Americans. We believe the situation to be intolerable. We believe that the federal government must utilize all of its authority to enforce the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the Constitution to all Americans. Intervention is necessary to break the violent, brutal cycle that is a reflection of systematic border town problems. A series of memos resulted in the decision to follow the recommendations of New Mexico Advisory Committee and pursue a deeper, more extensive investigation coupled with public hearings. All along, the coalition had wanted a full-scale public hearing, so they kept in close contact with members of the State Advisory Committee, hoping for information leak. It came the last day of July when they were informed that the representatives of the United States Civil Rights Commission would be coming to Farmington and at the end of August for 3 days of open hearings. Their orchestration of the announcement into public relations coup was masterful. The coalition leaders went to Albuquerque on August 1st and called a press conference at which they demanded that the hearing be held immediately. In the absence of hearings, they said they would issue a national call for continuous demonstrations in Farmington each day of the month and would march until hearings were scheduled. The very next day, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights formally announced and planned to hear testimony concerning civil rights issues affecting Native Americans in Farmington area in late August. Sorry. To all, wait, my throat's getting really dry. To all the world, it appeared that the commission had caved in to the coalition demand. In the aftermath of the riot, Marlo Webb daily found himself in the receiving end of press inquiries. The wire services, state newspapers, national magazines, reporters, stringers, freelancers all came to town to follow up on Farmington's Indian problems, and all, in his opinion, came with a liberal bias. He would be cooperative, he would be courteous, he would assume they were in pursuit of truth and tried to be factual in his replies to their questions. But even as he spoke, he could sense they already knew what kind of story they were going to write. Before they ever arrived in Farmington, they knew it was the home of provincial bigot. Without researching the situation, they knew the lineup. It was Farmington versus the Indians. Like some traditional school rivalry, and there were no doubt which team they were rooting for, they came to expose racial prejudice in the backwater Western community as if it were a private assignment that was only coincidentally linked to their job as journalists. He tried to tell them different. He would say, "You're looking for something like what happened in the South, but you won't find burning crosses or lynchings by the Klan here." He would get a flat look back and knew if he protested any louder, they would suspect him of being part of the cover up or conspiracy. Thanks to deadlines, most of the press in and out, but some hung around as if hoping to be on hand for the next violent outbreak. For a scene like the one promised by manager of Sambo's, "Hey, he was supposed to have said, ain't none of them some bitches gonna pull a sit down again in here." To try to, and I'm gonna get the CB, tell all them truckers in the area free coffee at Sambo's coming on down. I'm gonna fill the seats with my kind of people and we'll see what happens. It was an impossible situation for the mayor, and when he learned that the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights was planning to hold public hearings in August, he was afraid it was only to worsen things. Mayor Webb did not see the need. He thought it would be a waste of taxpayers' money. He was concerned that the outside intervention could only aggravate matters, and after pulling community leaders who agreed with him unanimously, he notified the commission that he was not requesting nor did he endorse the hearings. But even as he registered his objection, he knew it was lost cause, and when he was informed they proceed as scheduled with and without blessing, not to be completely shut out, he made it known that he wished to participate as a witness. The hearings were held in an auditorium at McGee Park under irritating conditions. The weather was hot, humid, so doors were kept open for ventilation, admitting hordes of flies and periodic gusts of dust. Numerous times the testimonies were drowned out by nearby road equipment sprucing up the grounds for the San Juan County Fair, and proceedings had to be temporarily halted. The audience was restless, constantly shifting in their seats, sitting for an hour or two, and then leaving the fresh air or refreshments at a hastily open stand across the grounds. One of the few attendees who remained for the entirety of the session was Mayor Marlo Webb, who not only sat through hours and hours of continuous testimony on hand, straight back chair, he took notes the whole time. And after 3 days of exhaustive testimony, his suspicions were confirmed. A pre-hearing briefing had assured him that those would be impartial hearings, not adversarial proceedings. But the contrary was the case. It was apparent to him what a major propaganda event was being staged. A mock trial in which Farmington was the defendant, the Coalition for Navajo Liberation, the prosecutor, commission's representatives, the judge and jury, and the outcome predetermined. The entire blame was going to be laid on the community. A prater witness alleged that Navajo people were not treated equally in schools, businesses, courts, jails, hospitals, and were the victims of consumer fraud, economic exploitation, and employment discrimination, which perpetuated poverty and helplessness and a despair that led to drunkenness. Altogether, they painted a dire picture and procedure more violence if the situation were not turned around soon. The mayor had heard it all before and thought of the most criticism had a rote quality, but the committee was obviously impressed and appeared to him to be deeply moved. And so when at last the mayor strode to the witness table for his turn, feeling he had nothing to lose, he prefaced his remark with a frontal attack on the credibility of the committee, liking these hearings to anti-prop. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, for the past 2 days, we have heard a great deal of testimony concerning the relationship of the Anglo community with the Navajo neighbors. The record has been filled with emotional statements, broad charges of discrimination, and many statements of untruths. Up to this time, I have found my pre-assessment of these hearings confirmed and my worst fears realized. Mr. Chairman, I have been documented evidence that the majority of this committee are members of the Communist Party, and this hearing is being held for the sole purpose of contributing to the outthrow of this government. Before some newsmen dash out of the room to phone in a headline, let me explain. I have made this malicious, unfounded, and untrue statement only to make a point. The statement, if left unexplained, as most of the testimony up now has been, would stand in the record as fact with no proof necessary or required. Such has been the case of these hearings. Accusations have been made without this documentation, broad charges made without specifics being asked for or cited. I believe that this failure to cross-examine, to insist on proof, or to even question much charges is indicative of the attitude of committee and the committee's preconceived judgments and personal prejudices. George Washington once said, "Truth will ultimately prevail if enough pains are taken to bring it to light." As a believer that there is no compromise for truth, I intend to see that truth does prevail. He proceeded to contradict the statements of majority of the proceeding witness and paint entirely different, far more benign picture of the Indian situation in Farmington. But even as he spoke, he sensed the futility of the endeavor and believed that rather than educating the committee, he was speaking for the record. So that's the end of chapter 9.